The United States has had its fair share of trying out price controls, and our first example that we're going to go over is from World War I. President Woodrow Wilson would tap future President Herbert Hoover to lead the Food Administration. The Food Administration was established to preserve food for the war effort. One of the first initiatives was to deliver a message to the United States to preserve food and live a simple life. It was a message. There was no strict policies put in place. It was reaching out to the American people and asking them to make the sacrifice of preserving and living a simple life so they did not have to put food rationing or strict food policies. At Hoover's discretion, he did have the power to control food prices, food distribution, and also influence agriculture. He would eventually implement price controls on some items like wheat, meat, and sugar, as U.S. food exports would increase to ship food overseas because of World War I. Compared to our next two examples, this was a pretty mild effort in regards to price controls to influence the market and tame inflation before it got out of hand. As a result of the policies implemented by Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Hoover, this was one of the more successful stories using limited price controls and more about government influence. The initiatives to preserve food and live a simple life were fairly successful. People adhered to those messages. Unfortunately, that did not stop post-World War I inflation from happening. There was still a fair amount of inflation that happened once war was over. Another example of U.S. price controls being implemented was in World War II. The Office of Price Administration, OPA, was established under the Emergency Price Control Act on January 30th, 1942. The OPA was in charge of making sure prices didn't rise because of the government's influence. The OPA had power to place price controls and ration goods and services. The OPA effectively had this job of keeping inflation at bay with various tools to do so. The theory was that if prices were left unregulated, the government's demand for goods and services due to World War II would create widespread inflation for civilians, among other things as well. Another problem that was impacting prices and inflation was imports. Japanese ships and German U-boats would sink or confiscate ships coming to the United States to bring imports. Items such as coffee, sugar, rubber, and even canned goods were short of supply. This led to a coupon system being implemented. It was a two-price system. Basically, price controls were set in place for the cost of items, but you also had to have a coupon to buy those items since they were being rationed for the war effort. As a result of World War II and some of these economic policies, this resulted in lower quality goods. Businesses would stretch ingredients and products to produce more. For example, meat packers would fill meat with fillers such as soybeans, potatoes, or even cracker meal. Products were not as good as they used to be. Also, black markets would start to develop. What exactly is a black market? A black market is an illegal market that operates alongside a government-regulated market. This would be like the mafia. The mafia would take the opportunity to create counterfeit coupons. The coupons needed to buy essential goods. They would also hijack trucks for their goods since they could resell them at a premium, and they know they have the demand for those products since there's low supply. Bartering. This is another example where families would trade goods and services amongst each other. If someone needed coffee and the other person had sugar, they could barter between the two families and exchange those goods. Then the OPA began sanctioning all the businesses that would violate the regulations. There are up to 259,966 sanctions. They were not that big of an organization. There's no way they could tackle that. So the regulator was over-regulating, coming down on all the businesses, and it was just becoming a very inefficient system. Our last example is going to be from the early 70s during the Nixon years. And did they have an impact on the economy going into the 70s, going through the 70s, and into the 80s? In the early 70s, stagflation was a major problem. President Nixon and his economic team would make some radical moves in an attempt to address the stagflation problem. Stagflation is when you have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time while the economic growth decreases. Usually, unemployment and inflation move in opposite directions, but with stagflation, they're both moving in the negative direction, and that's a big problem. Congress did pass legislation which allowed President Nixon to place wage and price controls, but Nixon originally vowed never to use them. However, he would test out a 90-day wage freeze among many other economic efforts. This is the time when the dollar went off the gold standard. Initially, these efforts were very well received. The government was taking action to address the stagflation. In 1972 and 1973, President Nixon and his economic advisors would double down on more price controls. As a result of these economic policies, you start to see some of the Soviet Union results from their material balance planning materialize in the United States economy with the price controls in place. Ranchers would stop shipping cattle. There would be supply shortages to rising costs. And with supply shortages, consumers went to the stores and they emptied the shelves. Most of the wage and price controls were abolished by April 1974, except for natural gas and oil. Nixon would resign in August 1974 due to Watergate. The U.S. was still experiencing very high inflation during that period of time. The oil and natural gas controls would stay in place until 1979, and that created some pretty chaotic times regarding to filling up your car. Dealers sold gas on a first-come, first-served basis. Gas stations would have long lines to obtain gas, and this would also implement favoritism. If you knew somebody who had gas or had a gas station and you were friends with them, you could possibly get gas before anyone else. The wage and price controls implemented by the Nixon administration did not stop inflation. Inflation was still very hot in the 1970s,